issue. Despite the efforts, and they did, Jay and Kyle both generated a lot of phone calls and things like that. But unfortunately, it's got to happen a lot more. We got to keep that pressure up. Now that the session's over, we're moving into campaign season. We need to let the candidates know about that. I'm going to move to our next question, and I'll call somebody, I guess, in the hole as well. First, we'll have Perry Mitchell, and then we'll have Don McAdam.
I love seeing the campaign pledge we have over here, but I hate seeing how few signatures there are on it. So I was just wondering, we're talking about grassroots and people speaking out more. Why couldn't there be a voter pledge? I'm not going to vote. I pledge not to vote for you if you don't sign this pledge. And maybe that would be a way to at least generate some publicity and gifts. I mean, turn the pledge around and make it come from the grassroots. And I just feel like it'd be a rallying cry for us, maybe. And it could be done on the internet now. I don't know about y'all, but I get 1 million petitions to sign. Well, here's the pledge right here. I could sign in a second. And I would also have to call my legislator and tell them, or email them, say, I'm not voting for you. I pledge not to vote for you if you don't sign this pledge.
I think it's a great idea. I think it's also important when a legislator gets a phone call, in his mind he automatically does the math. He figures that's about at least 20, 50, 100 other people who feel that way who didn't bother to call. But if you can, if you actually go up face to face to your legislator and ask them, did you sign that pledge? That face-to-face interaction is a powerful human thing. And when you're talking to them, it's not an email that they can ignore. You're standing there one-on-one. Are you going to sign this, yes or no? That's how you put them on the spot. That's how you force them to take that stance. And perhaps you might even have a copy of the pledge with you. Here, you can sign it right here, sir. Make it easy for you. One-stop shopping.
And Perry brings up a great point. We do have a Ethics Alliance website. It's georgiaethicsreform.com. There is currently a petition on there to support the legislation, and an intern in our office today was saying, how are we going to update that? And I think Perry Mitchell just gave us a great way to update that pledge, and so be looking for that very soon. We appreciate it very much. Next, we have a question from Mr. Don McAdam.
Disgraced lobbyist Jack Abramoff, now that he's out of jail, is calling for an absolute ban on lobbyist gifts because he figures that any amount of gift is basically a bribe. And I guess my question is, why a limit instead of a ban?
I'll take that on.
Okay.
Georgia, as I said earlier, is only one of 3 states with absolutely no limit on gifts. The surrounding states around us do, for the most part, have bans. But since we figured we were trying to go from 60 miles an hour, it was probably not likely we were going to get it to 0. So we're asking for a reasonable cap, a reasonable limit, so that we can put an end to the completely unlimited thing. And it's been quite a battle just trying to convince legislators to go for the cap. So a ban, I think, would be even more of a brick wall, even though I certainly would not oppose that. But we are trying to get it from completely unreasonable to reasonable. Do either of you have anything to add?
Georgia also has one of the worst paid legislatures in the country. And that's one of the things that comes up. And I think it's a reasonable point to consider as we have this debate, that we ask these legislators to come from far-flung parts of the state to Atlanta for 3, sometimes 4 months out of the year, not counting all the committee hearings they may have to attend during the rest of the year. And we don't pay them terribly well for that, even when you take account of the per diem. There's a limited number of people who are willing to give up the earning potential that they have or just sacrifice their jobs or careers, period, to come to Atlanta for that much time, or even if they live here, to devote that much time to legislative work. So I think if we move toward that, you know, we need to be prepared as citizens to have a reasonable dialogue about whether it makes sense to pay our legislators more in exchange for the expectation that they're not going to be going out all the time on lobbyists' dime.
I think I would totally agree. I don't remember what the most recent number is. Last time I looked, I think they're paid $17,000.
A little over 17,000.
And that hasn't been changed in years, I believe. And I think it's entirely appropriate, and I would personally fully support a package in which you increase that to $25,000 or $30,000, because you are asking an awful lot of people to come to Atlanta from the, as Kyle said, far-flung areas of the state and spend 3 or 4 months. So in return for a $100 gift ban limit or total ban, we will support raising your salary to $25,000 or $30,000 a year. I think that would cost the state very little, and I think would benefit the state immensely. I think a lot of legislators would love that, because it would free them up to some degree from depending on lobbyists, their favors, their charity, so to speak.
Well, I see here we've got another great idea. I'm going to call up Mr. Al Bartel, who wants to kind of put more of a local angle on it. Mr. Bartel, if you'll come up.
My question does go to the local angle for both of you, and that is the involvement of all elected officials, and particularly around the metro area. We have several counties, and each one of those counties have anywhere from 5 to 15 municipalities, and they all have city council members and mayors. And my question is, how do we get at least the mayors, if not even city council members, but the mayors of the existing municipalities in metropolitan Atlanta to get on board and support this particular piece of legislation for the ban on lobbyist gifts? How do we get those mayors to get on board and get involved and push for this legislation?
Well, I'll ask the dean of our panel, since Jay's been at this since 1990. Is it effective to get local leaders to try to push state leaders to do things? Have you seen success with that?
I would be doubtful that would work, mainly because those mayors are going to their state legislators and asking for a lot of things already. They are going, asking, begging, soliciting from the state legislators for things in the budget, for this little tweak in the law we need, et cetera, et cetera. They're not going to be in a position, they're not going to be willing to go and say, put pressure on, if you don't do this, you don't sign this legislation on ethics reform, I'm not going to support you. That's not the kind of, it's just not a realistic means of putting pressure on them.
Kyle, do you have anything?
Well, one issue to think about from a local perspective, and this isn't really what you were talking about, but local officials are subject to many of the same ethics laws as the state elected officials are, and there is an organization formerly known as the State Ethics Commission, now the Georgia Government Transparency and Campaign Finance Commission.
I think you need a hand for that.
I can't quite remember it all at one time.
And the amazing thing is, they changed it to the Georgia Government Transparency and Campaign Finance Commission. They took ethics out of it, so nobody could file an ethics complaint against them.
But local officials are subject to the same laws, and one legitimate criticism I've heard of our system here in Georgia is that there's not enough funding for that commission to do the education for the local elected officials that we need to have, and so that's something that the legislators sometimes talk about. They could put more money in the budget for that. We're really talking about fractions of a fraction of the overall state budget when we get to that. So even a fiscal, tight-fisted conservative like myself can support something like that.
And most local governments, cities and counties, have their own policies that ban mayors, city council members, county commissioners from taking these kind of gifts. You've got those bans and limits at the local level. Somebody mentioned Jack Abramoff. Largely as a result of that whole scandal in Congress, there is now a ban on Congress and congressional staff members from accepting anything of value from lobbyists. So you've got a lot of politicians here in Georgia who talk about the corrupt Congress, and they run against it and act as if they're, unethical and corrupt, but the matter of fact is Congress has been more willing to pass tough, ethical gift bans, et cetera, than the Georgia legislature, who has none. Again, as William and Kyle both have pointed out, we're only one of 3 states in the country that does not have any kind of restriction.
Now, we've seen some great reporting at the national level suggesting that some members of Congress have found other ways to get favors from certain companies or organizations wanting their support, and we've seen that with the stock trading sort of activity where acting on insider information. That just goes to highlight, I think, once again, that this has to be a continuing effort to monitor government. Certainly something that's occupied the press for hundreds of years. So.
And that's a good point, because it gets back to what we were talking earlier about the explanation of Georgia legislators is, no, we don't want to pass a ban because people will just try to get around it. It's an interesting argument, because basically, on the one hand, they're saying we're so ethical we don't need legislation, but we're so unethical that if you pass a law against it, we're going to break it. There's a conflict of message there that I don't think they fully comprehend.
Well, and the amazing thing to me, and Common Cause focuses a lot on trying to bring people from the left and the right to the middle to meet everybody in the issues that we all care about. But this particular issue doesn't seem to be a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. It's a leadership issue. Once another party takes over, they no longer push for what they were pushing for in the beginning. Do either of you kind of see any partisan difference in this, or is it truly a leadership difference?
In '92, when we were pushing so hard, it was Speaker Tom Murphy and the Democrats who were fighting it tooth and nail. And the Republicans, there were relatively few of them at the time, were pushing it in favor of it. And now you have the exact opposite, because one side sees a political advantage to pushing, and the other side sees they're the ones, the 20%, 80% that Kyle was talking about, they're the ones collecting. Most Democrats don't get a whole lot, only because they don't have power. Lobbyists don't really care about it. But if you get power, all of a sudden lobbyists want to be your best friend. It's funny how that works.
And that's a good lead into our question. I'm going to ask Scott Turner to come up, but Kyle, while he's coming up, if you want to go ahead and address that point.
And I meant to mention it earlier when we were when you made the point about bribery. I think certainly that can be applicable in some cases. I think there's a subtler thing that happens here, though, and it speaks to the limitations of transparency, too. If you look in these reports, the number of reports that you get that actually list a bill number under the section legislation discussed, it's a fraction of the total. And so one of the things I think happens is a lot of times this is just relationship building, it's friendship building, and that's a very powerful thing. It's harder to say no to your friends, and that's a lot of times what this is about. And then I have no doubt that the morning after the Hawks game that they attended together, there's a discussion about someone's stance on a particular bill. But it is subtler than the outright bribery.
Well, just to show you that how this crosses the ideological divide, that's what Kyle just said is basically my column for tomorrow. I'm sure he hasn't read it, but that's what my column says.
Buy the paper anyway.
We very much agree on that.
I want to commend Kyle for making that point in one of your columns and really doing some good research on that and showing that so often that space for what the legislation discussed is the NA. The NA/NA often not covered at all.
And it's a real limitation on the idea that transparency cures all on this issue.